If the thought of setting boundaries in your marriage seems harsh, unrealistic, not practical, or perhaps even that they'll make things worse in your marriage, you may be misunderstanding what boundaries actually are. When I would think about setting some boundaries in my marriage, I often wrestled with those kind of thoughts that they felt harsh and unrealistic and not practical. And yes, they might make things worse in terms of reactions and things like that. Yet the irony is that when boundaries are missing, things can feel overwhelming in a marriage and quickly spiral. It can seem easier to just shut down or to keep the peace, or when you do want to speak up, you feel dismissed and completely misunderstood. So you withdraw a little and then a little more. And it feels like you're walking on eggshells. And before you know it, you start questioning everything about your marriage. And that's exactly the position that I found myself in. And so in those moments, my go-to strategy was to keep the peace no matter the cost. And I would keep what I was feeling and wanting to talk about it, telling myself I'll just wait till a better time. But often, a better time never showed up. Now, I found myself in the situation where that strategy had to change. It was no longer going to work for me anymore because my husband suffered a major breakdown and was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, and subsequently medically discharged from the army that he'd been serving in for 13 years, and I became his primary carer. So everything radically, dramatically changed. And I needed a new strategy because what might have seemed to so-called work for me before, even though it wasn't healthy, it was just off the table now. And so I needed to set some boundaries, not in the context of our marriage, because my husband was in no condition to have these kinds of conversations. I started to work on me and setting my own internal boundaries for myself. Here's what I learned. Boundaries are not about changing your spouse. They are not ultimatums. They are not threats. They are not silent treatments. They are not, if you love me, you would do fill in the blank. No. Instead, for me, a boundary became a decision that I would make about what I would and would not participate in and how I would respond when a line would be crossed. These were internal boundaries that I set for myself before even thinking about boundaries within the broader context of our marriage and having that conversation with my husband. So I want to talk to you and share with you this 3-part internal boundary framework that I set up for myself that I'm sure will help you as well. Now, first things first, this kind of work doesn't happen overnight. It's not an overnight solution. It takes practice, it takes time, it takes iteration and learning. So, part 1 of this 3-part framework begins with awareness. I realized that I needed to get really clear about the patterns in myself I was noticing, identify what I needed to do differently, and then follow through with action. And this shift and focus towards setting internal boundaries for myself was a game changer for me. It gave me clarity and a structure and filtered out a lot of the noise from the overwhelm that I'd been experiencing up to this point. So, what's involved in the 3-part internal boundary framework? Well, the first step is awareness. Name the pattern. I knew I couldn't set a boundary around something I hadn't first acknowledged. So here's some questions to ask for yourself. What keeps happening? What keeps happening? What do you feel after it happens? Is there resentment? Is there shutdown? Is there withdrawal or anger or sadness? What's behind that? Where are you abandoning yourself to avoid conflict? So these are just some thought starter questions to consider to cultivate that awareness. Then next is ownership. Decide your line. What is no longer okay for you? What are you willing to do differently? And this is important, regardless of how your spouse reacts. Because boundaries are about your behavior, not their compliance. Internalizing that to me, in that whole scene that I just described for you, boundaries were about my behavior and the things I needed to do to change that. Third is choosing your action. Now, in this setting, this is where I began to put boundaries on the table with my husband because we knew that we needed to talk through some really hard things. But before we started on that path, we set up a bit of an infrastructure around us of what boundaries looked like for him and for me. And those boundaries that we agreed to had an action focus. What do I mean by that? Well, it kind of sounded something like this. Rather than me leading with, I need to talk to you about this thing, I would say instead, is now a good time to talk? And he knew that if it wasn't a good time for him in that moment, I would negotiate with him a time later in the day. And that way he knew we'd pick up the conversation later on. We also agreed that if emotions started to get high, we both agreed we'd take a time out and then come back to the conversation later on. And another boundary that I set for myself was not to start conversations at the end of the day when I'm about to go to bed, knowing that I was really tired, because I knew myself well enough to know when I'm tired, my emotional, what's the word I'm looking for? Managing my emotions is a lot harder when I'm really tired. So I just knew not to do that. And I want to give you one more practical example of an internal boundary that I set for myself. The awareness piece that happened was I noticed that I started mirroring my husband's emotional state. So when he was, really down and low and all that sort of thing, I started mirroring that back to him, to our children, and I recognized that that had to change. And so the choice that I made was the moment that I started to recognize that cycle of mirroring his emotional state, I interrupted it, whether it's changing the thought or doing something different, really just shifting the state that I was in at the time, just taking that action. And after a while, that habit that I had started to form began to shift into something much more constructive in response to that internal boundary that I set for myself. I couldn't afford to let myself go down a spiral like that when I'm caring for my husband and caring for our children at that point in time. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, what if boundaries do make things worse? Or what if my husband, wife doesn't actually respect the boundaries that I set for myself? I want to give you this quote that I love from Brene Brown, and she wrote, daring to set boundaries is about having the courage to love ourselves when we risk disappointing others. Yes, there is a risk that it doesn't go as well as you planned. And I think that my biggest fear was, if this makes things worse, what do I do if the boundary isn't respected? And the best thing I did to mitigate those risks was just being upfront and telling my husband directly, I'm setting some internal boundaries for myself, and I'm going to shift that into boundaries for us going forward. He knew what I was trying to achieve. And then when we were ready, we sat down and talked about mutual boundaries. What sort of boundaries did he want to establish? What sort of boundaries did I want to establish? And we met in the middle. And no, it didn't always work every single time. So we would just try to understand why and explore that further. Now, having heard all of that, if you're realizing that internal boundaries are something that you've not really focused on or learned about, but recognize that you need, and you don't want to navigate those changes on your own, I've created a Skool community that's a space to learn, reflect, and grow together and be inspired together. Ultimately, to take the lead and become the change that you've been wanting to see in your marriage. And in terms of the topic for today in this video, when it comes to boundaries, what feels hardest for you? Let me know in the comments below. Or what success have you had in setting either internal boundaries or boundaries in your relationship and how you navigated that? I'd love to hear more about it. And don't forget to hit like, subscribe so you can get more of these videos down the track.